Morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. Just want to mention a couple of things before we get started. First and foremost, your third reflection paper is going to be due tomorrow, which is Friday, March 30th by 11:59 p.m. So the Dropbox is on As You Learn. So make sure you turn that in as soon as possible. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Like I said, I'm always available to help out. I'm getting a few questions, but not too many. So if you still have some confusion, if you're still not sure what you're doing, again, now is the time to ask because papers are going to be due tomorrow. So make sure you're setting up in that area. The other thing is that we do have our exam next week, starting on Wednesday, ending on Friday. So be sure to take a look at that when that comes up on As You Learn. Study guide is available, as well as a video we're explaining the study guide. So again, make sure that you're looking through it. Make sure that you're understanding where the terms are, because this will pay great dividends to make sure that you're on the same page with everything, especially when you're taking the exam, because it's 75 minutes. So I want to make sure that you've got all the time you need to take the exam. But part of that will be assessed in the fact that you need to remember to, you need to remember to where all the losing my train of thought here. You need to remember where all the terms are, so you can make sure that everything is clear when you get to those aspects of the test. Excuse me. So what I want to talk about today is part of our Theory Thursday, and Theory Thursday today kind of looks at a bit of two theories here. I'm really going to take an anchor in one of them, which is the social judgment process, which deals a lot. I know we've explained elaboration likelihood model in the past, and this is the kind of thing where we're dealing with another kind of dual processing model in this case. So again, I do want to explain that. I do want to also explain where a very common and popular theory within psychology is boomerang effect. Give an example of that and understand where some of this information is, and a little bit of the debate of where these two places come into perspective. So we've talked about the aspect of receiving information as a persuasive message, and much as this is the sender and the receiver, in terms of the person sending the message and the receiver processing the message. So this goes a little bit back into interpersonal communication. And it really deals with how do we take information that's given to us and place it into areas of whether we agree or disagree or have non-commitment towards. So this is a real important theory to be talking about, because this is something that we all experience at one time or another. We all have very strong opinions about certain things, strong values, strong attitudes, beliefs in that case. And so when we hear messages that we might disagree with or we agree with, this is an area that it can be a little bit interesting to understand where we fall into these areas here. So I've talked about the essence of attitudes, values, beliefs, and how they play in terms of how much we listen. So one of the things that I wanted to mention before we even get into some of this stuff is understanding that when we have a strong opinion towards something, this is going to be a major consideration when we get into latitudes of acceptance and rejection here. And the reason is if we don't have a whole lot of stock in certain things of controversy, whether they be whether it be an area that you're not exactly interested in, you might go into that latitude of non-commitment because you may feel indifferent about it or maybe apathetic to. And that's fine. I mean, again, we're not all going to have the same passions. We're not all going to have the same interests. But the notion here is where we fall on this, especially if there is what's called a CES level of ego involvement that you see up here. So think of it in the way of that we're delivering a message. Either we're sending the message or somebody else is sending the message, and we're receiving this, or another person is receiving this message. And they go through an assess level, what's called ego involvement. And ego involvement looks at that these extreme stands have these wide latitudes of rejection or acceptance in this case. So what you see here is this latitude, and it doesn't really do its justice on this particular drawing itself here, in this little model, because you think of it as kind of like a timeline. And there's a section in the middle, so somewhere around here, that would say, here is an area where I am not committed. I really don't have much opinion about, but then I go into this very wide range of a latitude of rejection or a very wide range of latitude of acceptance. And what this means is, if we're giving a piece of information that's controversial, let's say that we're dealing with politics and gun control, and I know some of you, if you mention the term gun control, it may fall into this latitude of acceptance or latitude of rejection or non-commitment, depending on how you look at it. And so, going through some of the things that you've posted and we've talked about, you're going to have different stances on this. And it's an interesting area of debate in terms of where it falls within this line in terms of this latitude. So it could fall in an area where I'm moving my mouse right here, where you might say, I accept it, but it's not something that I feel extremely passionate about. I just feel like this is something that needs to be done. I feel like this is something that is interesting to me, but it's not so important that I'm going to, like some people would go for a march in this case, where their latitude of acceptance for gun control is extremely high. And this is where that ego involvement comes in. So again, when you're presenting a message, it's about how big that latitude is in terms of how we accept it. So their concept within the social judgment process, and what's really important about it is, it basically says, if you've ever taken a survey before where it says, how do you feel a certain way about something, and it's yes, no, maybe. They've got like 3 points on something, and this is an important area where we're dealing more with scales. So if you've ever heard of a Likert type scale, where there's 7 points, so you have like strongly disagree to indifferent to strongly agree. And these particular areas establish this notion of, you may not exactly have this strong opinion about it, but you do either agree or disagree to some regard. So that is a limitation, though, if you're just doing nominal data of I agree with something, I disagree with something, or I feel indifferent about it. Implementing a latitude of several points, whether they be 5 or 7 or 9, to get that gauge of where we sit on that latitude is important. And again, the way you feel about certain topics is going to be different from subject to subject. I care a great deal about sports, for instance, and a lot of you could care less about that, and that's okay. But again, my latitudes of acceptance and rejection are going to be much different in terms of the areas of ego involvement. So first, though, let's go into latitude of non-commitment, and this is pretty easy to go through. It says the range of positions that a person feels neutral or indifferent about. And many of us, again, for the most part, when it comes to certain topics, we're usually kind of somewhere in that middle ground of latitude or non-commitment, that we don't necessarily want to take a stand in something. We just kind of stay in the middle and say, that's not a real concern of mine. So again, this can be practical. Anything can work here. So, if you're giving a persuasive message, I know some of y'all were talking about some areas within church, and a couple examples within church, where you would say, I'm not that committed in terms of taking this extreme stand one way or the other. So you stay kind of in that indifferent zone. However, if you agree with somebody, this range is ready to accept or agree, is that latitude of acceptance. Again, what this means, and just kind of its simplicity, is that we take into effect that we have this anchor of we feel strongly for something. So if a message is delivered and we agree with it, it's going to fall within that latitude of acceptance. And what's interesting is we all have what's called anchors. And this is something that's mentioned in social judgment process, is that we have an anchor of this area of acceptance. So it can be very strongly perceived over here. It can be somewhere right near non-commitment, or it can just be you have a good, strong opinion about it, but you're not, again, going to be completely obsessed with a particular topic in mind. And again, that latitude of acceptance is an anchor. And this is where assimilation effect come into play, is that we might actually perceive our opinion about something as further than we really think it is. And okay, so that may sound confusing. Think of it in the way that we can perceive politics in this case. If you're watching a television show and you say this message is extremely liberal or this message is extremely conservative, and I identify as a conservative or a liberal in this case, we might say I fall within this latitude of acceptance where I assimilate, where their stance may be a little bit more extreme than mine. However, since I am in this latitude of acceptance, I feel like I agree more strongly than I actually do. So I don't know if that, and I'm going to try to let that sit for a second. Feeling a way that you perceive that you agree with something more than you actually do. So again, some of you, and this goes back in that commitment and consistency, some of you might feel like I'm committed to something, but how much do I really care about it? How much do I really accept this particular area within political boundaries in this case? And it may be that you don't care that much about it, but because of where you stand in your political spectrum, that you may feel that you are much stronger than you actually are when it comes to feeling a certain way about your political beliefs. And I think a lot of us experience something like that. I mean, and again, this can be plenty of things that can go into acceptance. Whereas in rejection, obviously, we go into the exact opposite range, where we say, I find this objectionable, I'm not a big fan of what's being said, I'm going into a message. Now, we can either ignore it or keep listening and go into our latitude of rejection. So again, if I'm listening to a political message, I might sit there and say, I reject the premises because of who it's coming from, because what party it's coming from, that kind of thing. And within that range, I might say I'm very political in this case, so I'm going to strongly reject it. Or I might be slightly political, and I just quasi-reject it. And this is where contrast effect comes into play. It's just the same with assimilation effect of feeling like you disagree with something stronger than you actually do. And you may have had this time or another. This is where boomerang effect comes in. And I mentioned an example of a piece that I thought was really interesting in terms of boomerang effect was the Above the Influence campaign. And I actually don't know how much that's around. I don't have cable anymore, so I don't really see their advertisements as much anymore. But for a long period of time, especially in the early aughts and going into 2010, was this whole notion of an anti-marijuana campaign because it's perceived as this gateway drug. And you can obviously have your own opinions about that. But again, it's perceived that way. And the purpose of it was to promote these what are called high sensation seeking advertisements. So they're extreme examples of what might happen if you were to smoke marijuana in this case. And so again, they offer some kind of outlandish things. So what would end up happening was they would go for this latitude of acceptance to say these are the areas where people should be as scared of the risks that are adapted with smoking marijuana. Again, whether you agree or not that there are risks is completely on you in this case. But again, they're looking for this latitude of acceptance for people to agree with them. But what actually happened was people had a latitude of rejection. And so through their model, through boomerang effect, they would say that they went in this latitude of rejection from only being, or let me actually back up. So okay, never mind. Sorry, I had a thought. I'm going to express that in a minute. The latitude of rejection to say, I slightly disagree with some of the areas of what's being perceived as dangerous within these advertisements. But now, because of boomerang effect, they wanted me to go to this latitude acceptance. But what actually happens is, where I'm originally here, I actually go further into this area. Or if you're non-committed and you see these extreme examples, I'm going to go into a latitude of rejection. Now, here's the area that these two theories kind of collide, and they might disagree with each other in some regard. I don't think anybody's going to say that boomerang effect doesn't exist. That because kind of a reverse psychology, just because somebody says you to do something, you do the exact opposite, and you might have a much different opinion based on just that message that's coming in this case. However, in the case of social judgment, they might actually say that it's not inherently that you're moving in a boomerang effect. But if you're in a non-committal state about, again, marijuana or something like that, and you see a message that's trying to get you into a latitude of acceptance, you may, in that boomerang effect, go into the latitude of rejection. That said, what if you were in the latitude of rejection already and you saw this message? Boomerang effect might argue that you would move even further down that area of rejection. However, social judgment might get into this area where they would say, you just strengthen your anchor right here. You don't exactly move further to where you act more and more about this particular area. You just strengthen the area in which you're in. And again, this may lead to some contrast effect to where you think that your latitude of rejection is a lot stronger than it actually is. So again, those are social judgment and boomerang effect. They're really cool theories, and I always love doing these on Thursday because I think they're very interesting. I hope you do too. I hope you enjoy them. We're coming towards the end of this semester. It's not far until everything is due. So again, we'll be talking about a couple of different things. I think we've only got 1, 2, 3 more Theory Thursdays. Wow, not a lot. However, like I said, make sure that you're keeping on track with your papers, getting into talking about the final project, which we will do soon. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next week. Thanks.